All right, Kyle, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start off with your background, sort of where you're from, the arc of your career and what you're doing now.
I'm originally from North Carolina, born in New York, but from North Carolina. Moved to Washington, D.C. Right after college. I've been here since 2002. Came here for one purpose, which was to work on Capitol Hill for a congressman. Like anyone, or like most people who end up on the Hill, I started interning for a number of members. First interned for a member who's now sort of infamous, Tom DeLay of Texas, who was nicknamed the Hammer, was the longtime majority whip in the House of Representatives. And then got a full-time position with Roy Blunt, who was succeeding Tom DeLay as the whip. I worked for him for 6 years. Originally started out as what's called his body guy. So the person who is supposed to drive him around, get him to meetings. He had detail at that time, though, by becoming the majority whip. So he didn't need a body guy. So the job lasted about 3 or 4 months. Luckily, another job opened up at the same time in his office, and I joined his floor staff. And we can talk a little bit about that more later. But I worked in his floor office then for 5.5 years, eventually became his floor director. Then he left leadership. Eric Cantor, who was his longtime chief deputy whip, became the whip in the House, minority whip at that time. Republicans were in the minority. I worked for Eric for 4 years, a little over 4 years, both leading his whip operation as his director of floor operations. And then when Republicans won the majority at the end of 2010, I became his deputy chief of staff when Eric became the majority leader. I worked in the majority leader's office for a little over 2 years as his deputy chief of staff, and then left the Hill for the private sector. I joined a sort of medium-sized government affairs lobbying firm, bipartisan, here in DC. Was there for 2 years, then got the entrepreneurial sort of itch, and joined up with a few friends and like-minded individuals who had been in congressional leadership throughout their careers on Capitol Hill, and started our own firm. And we have been doing that now for about 7 years.
Great. Well, why don't we start up with your experience in the leadership side of things, and particularly on the whips. We talked to Larry Evans earlier, and he's had us a book on the whips where he talks about the mechanics of that over time, and this notion that a lot of preferences are in play on major legislation up until the end. So it would really be interesting to hear your perspective on that office, what it does, how it works, and how it plays out in real time, when things are happening on the Hill.
Yeah. Well, I've worked for two whips, like I said, Roy Blunt and then Eric Cantor. So I have a very good appreciation for the House Republican whip operation. It differs between parties, and it differs across the two chambers as well. So it's important to note that the whip position is a bit different as you go between the parties, and then also between the two chambers. There's been some notable whips over the years. Dick Cheney was a Republican whip in the House when he was a member. Tom DeLay, as I mentioned previously, was the longtime whip for House Republicans from the time of the Republican Revolution of Newt Gingrich in '94 up through becoming majority leader in 2003. And then, like I said, Roy Blunt, Eric Cantor. Often on the Republican side, the whip has a chief deputy whip, which is an appointed position to leadership, unlike whip. And the majority of the leadership positions are all voted on by the membership, by your conference or caucus. So you're put in those positions by your fellow members. The chief deputy whip is the only appointed position on the Republican side, and often acts as a springboard. So Denny Hastert was the chief deputy whip to Tom DeLay and then became Speaker of the House. Roy Blunt was the chief deputy whip to Tom DeLay and then became whip. Eric Cantor was the chief deputy whip to Roy Blunt, and so on. Kevin McCarthy, who's the current leader of House Republicans, was the chief deputy whip to Eric Cantor. So that whip operation is often the springboard for leadership ambitions, whether it's the whip himself or herself or the chief deputy whip. I think what makes it such an effective springboard within leadership is the characteristic of that job, which is to know these congressional districts better than any single member in the House. And that is the case for both House Democrats and House Republicans. Senate side, it's a little bit easier. You're talking about states, you're talking about 50 states, 100 members. It's not that tough to discern what moves those states or those members. In the case of congressional districts, whether you're in the majority or the minority, you're talking about 200 plus congressional districts that you're having to know as the whip for your party. That's a lot of knowledge. It's a lot of local knowledge. It means a lot of travel is required, both on the fundraising side, but also just trying to recruit new members. And anytime you're dealing with legislation, then you rely on that knowledge of those congressional districts. That is what is the most important aspect of being a successful whip, is knowing those districts. You can't push those levers unless you know what is driving a member's decision back home. What are the push and pulls in each of those congressional districts? So effective whips over time, and there's been some ineffective whips, but by and large, we've had some pretty effective whips over the last 2-3 decades. And it's because they have a better knowledge of member districts than anyone else in the party.
So how do they get this knowledge? Is it statistical knowledge? Is it because they've got relationships in the districts? Is it because they read the local news? How do they get this insight into the local? Is it data driven? How do they get that insight into the local district makeup or interests?
Sure. There's a little bit of all of it, but mostly it's learned knowledge. It's on the ground. Like I say, it's beginning to end with members. So the whip has a heavy role in recruiting new members into to run for office. So if you're looking for the best candidate in Texas 22, the whip is talking with the NRCC, the political arm of the party, is out there actively recruiting. So they know the members before they even get here. On top of that, it's, once you start going through legislation with a conference or a caucus, those member opinions are going to come out of the woodwork. The whip makes time, more than anyone else, makes time to hear those member opinions. So often a whip's schedule during the day, they're not spending time in committees. Leadership, those top positions of leadership, the whip, the leader, the speaker, they're not serving on congressional committees. Their time is spent on that leadership office. And in the case of different leadership offices, there's different focuses. In the case of the whip, the time is spent on the members themselves. And so whips get better with age. The more they know the membership, the better and more effective they are at their jobs. But it's mostly learned.
And so let's move on to their jobs then. What exactly are the whips trying to do?
The whips are trying to get the votes to pass the party's agenda. If they're in the majority. If they're in the minority, they're trying to deprive the majority from passing their agenda. That's really it in a nutshell. So that starts, take it from the majority's perspective, that starts with an idea. Today we have this latest Biden proposal on infrastructure. I can guarantee that the Democratic whips, House and Senate, are now working with their members to find out what the pressure points are. And we see a lot of the pressure points in the media, a member complaining about SALT deduction not being in that proposal or whatever else. And the whips are doing a little bit of whack-a-mole as a result. But on something that is as big as that proposal, they'll probably hold listening sessions, bring in members specifically for the purpose of hearing their feedback on legislation. And then they will formally, at some point before a bill is brought to the floor of that magnitude and that is going to be party line, they will initiate an actual formal whip, whereby take a conference of 250 members, break it up in thirds or fourths, and you have a whip team, about a fourth of the conference, that then goes ask the question of all of those members. They're assigned 3 to 4 members apiece, and they're going around and surveying the members. How are you going to vote on this piece of legislation? And you give them 5 possible answers. Yes, lean yes, undecided, lean no, and no. And then once you get all that information back and tabulate it, now you're working on the actual sticks and carrots to get them to move from no, lean no, undecided, lean yes, all in as many as you need into that yes category. In the case of the House, it's 218 votes that you need. With a full House of 435 members, you need 218 votes. So as soon as you get to that number, then you're probably good. But that can be a short process or a very long process.
So when they collect the information from the various members through this process, and that's quite a lot of people in the WIP organization, I know those have grown over time.
Mm-hmm.
Do they use a software to collect that information? Is there a central dashboard of whippery, inside the leadership office, or is it more informal? How does that actually work in real time?
It's very rudimentary. But yes, there is a little bit of software at play. The Republican side and Democrat side are a bit different in how they initiate the process. On the Democratic side, I think they do it through email, where they're just sending out, how is your boss? The floor office for the whip is sending out an email to all the Democratic offices asking how they're going to vote on this upcoming legislation. And then the staff is responsible for getting those answers back. And then the whip staff is tabulating them. On the Republican side, it's different. It's member driven. And part of the reason is you want to keep the sanctity of member word to member word. If that's the bond and there's no staff, there's no telephone, there's no email in the way, if the bond is member word to member, then it's pretty strong. You don't have a lot of wiggle room when you go to the floor. The last thing that you want is to think you have 220 votes to pass something, and in reality you have 210 because a handful of members did not tell you exactly, or they flipped before they came down to vote. So that happens less if it's just member to member. So for Republicans, the members are going down during a vote series on the floor. Let's say we have 3-4 votes going on, and they've got a good chunk of time, an hour to an hour and a half on the floor. One member has responsibility for 3 other members. They're going and taking a piece of paper to them and saying, this is what is in this bill that we're going to be voting on in a week. Tell me how you're going to answer it, how you're going to vote on it. Marking that answer down and any comments, initial comments the member had, taking that back to the whip's office, to the floor staff of the whip, all those pieces of paper coming back in, and it's sort of like a little checklist. Then that floor staff is tabulating that in a little bit of a software program, and it spits out, tabulates where everybody is. Now you have your list, and the whip himself or herself, along with the chief deputy whip, are now coming up with a strategy on how to move the necessary votes to the yes column.
And there must be some kind of prioritization there based on, as you said, insights into the districts, right? So if you have, say 50 that you need to work on, you'll select the 50 that have the districts that might put pressure in the direction you want.
Yeah. And then there's also the political considerations where, we're in the majority, but we're only in the majority by 10 seats. And those 10 seats are highly vulnerable. They're, they can go either way in an election cycle, and you're trying to protect them. So if it's a tough political vote, you're not going to put pressure on those members. or you hope you don't have to put pressure on those members because you have all these other members who can take this vote. It's no problem in their district. So you're focusing on those, the ones who can afford to take it first before you go to the members who can't afford to take it, and you may lose your majority as a result of making them vote for it.
Got it. So there's some segmentation that happens among the members in terms of, and it probably, I would assume, changes from issue to issue, that segmentation.
Changes issue to issue, you have on the Republican, and it changes over the years too, as the party evolves. I can think back to the early 2000s on trade votes were very difficult because we had a number of pro-labor House Republicans. That doesn't really exist anymore. You don't have many pro-labor House Republicans, but back then we did. Steve LaTourette from Ohio, plenty of others throughout the Northeast. So it changes as the party evolves, the push and pull evolves. And then it's also personality driven. One single member who's difficult to deal with because of their personality, not because of their district, changes, the composition of a whip check. Whereas, 2 years later, if someone else is in that seat, they may be the most affable member in the world and is never an issue on a whip check. But usually you have, a handful of those type of members who it's just all personality driven with them.
Got it. And so once you have this list of, members that you need to engage, how does that process work?
Hopefully it's not too big of a list. But on most things that have risen to that level of a whip check, they are the issues that you need to pass no matter what. There's not really an alternative, whether it was one of these trade agreements from back in the 2000s, or it's the ACA in the case of Democrats' majority in 2009, 2010, or it's tax reform during the first year of the Trump administration. These are high-level issues that no is not an answer. So it is go as hard as you can until you get there. I can think the first year I was on the Hill in the whip office was 2003, and there was an infamous vote back then for adding a prescription drug benefit for seniors for Medicare. So Medicare Part D was added at the end of 2003. We had a vote on the floor where we thought we were about there on the numbers. So we thought we had 218 because we thought some Democrats were going to come on board. Well, the Democrats withheld their vote and we were left a little bit naked on the floor. The vote was held open for 6 hours. So we had one vote on the House floor where we're trying to get to 218 and not taking no for an answer. And we just ground it out on the floor. That usually does not happen. But from the outset, the mentality is we're not taking no for an answer. We're getting there. We're getting to 218. So that's the start of it. Once you know that's the case, you've got a list, and there are always the easy ones to pick off, the undecideds of the world. And you usually start there, trying to move them into the lean yes or yes column. And mostly they just want to be heard. Your port psychiatrist, a therapist for these members of, I got passed over for this committee position, or my chairman hasn't been nice to me for the last week, or, it can be anything. I'm having trouble at home, in my personal life. And so you're there just to listen to them. And those can usually move pretty quickly. The issues are small. And then there's the ones that are the hell no. Hopefully you're not going into the hard no category and needing votes from there, because that's when things get really, really tough going. And you just pull out all the stops at the end of the day. You make commitments to them. It could be back in the day of earmarks. It could be that you were helping them get an earmark that they needed for the district.
That could be coming back, I guess, right?
What's that?
That could be coming.
Yeah, they are coming back. Yes. Sometimes they wanted a ride on Air Force One. There were plenty of things at your disposal. And, you didn't want to bring out the big guns, but sometimes you had to.
So I'm sure there's, a lot of craft there, and then probably the whip style is, also a factor in that. Over the years, different whips approach that in different ways. Thinking, Johnson, I guess, was famous for his ability to convince people to do things. But in terms of the substance of the bill, how often would that be a piece of the discussion, or even a possibility to change the substance when you were engaged in this whip activity?
A huge piece, and I should have mentioned that. The policy aspect of it is huge. So a lot of times these bills are needing to be tweaked as you're getting close to the floor. You may be out of the committee process by then. Often you are. The committee is already. You've done some of this due diligence prior to actually doing this formal whip check. Along the way, you knew that there were member problems, and you were trying to solve them in committee. But once it gets out of committee, it's still going to change. The House Rules Committee is a powerful tool of the majority. They can change a bill any way they want at the last minute. If you're voting tomorrow, they can change it minutes before. And so a lot of times, yes, it is members. In the case of trade agreements, what I was bringing up in the early 2000s, that's hard because that's a negotiated trade agreement. Congress does not have a role in, because of Trade Promotion Authority, Congress does not have a role in the those have already been negotiated between the countries. So you can't open that back up. That's done. What you did in the case of trade agreements is have these side deals, these side agreements that were committed to outside of the actual trade agreement. In the case of all the other legislation, though, it's a moving target. So yeah, you're trying to, if it's an easy fix, of course, go ahead and do it. But often, if you pull a string here, you're creating a problem on the other end. So you have to be very careful about changing legislation at the last minute.
And the whip apparatus is only activated, in my understanding, for major bill, like as you say, must pass kinds of situations, not for every bill that comes through.
Yeah.
How is that prioritization done with leadership about what to whip and what not to whip?
It can be a source of contention sometimes, because the wishes of the majority leader, who technically sets the agenda for the House or the Senate, wants their agenda passed, as is. Sometimes the votes just aren't there to pass an agenda. So there's pressure back and forth, within the leadership about what you should or should not whip. A whip wants to be successful, so they don't want to be given a task that they know they're going to fail at. They at least want it to be in the art of the achievable. So, they may push back against the leader or the speaker telling them to whip something because they know that there's no chance of success. But ultimately, the party at the beginning of the year is going to come up with an agenda that's important to them. And it's pretty clear what's going to be partisan and party line. And that's generally how you take your cues. Those big ticket items that are very important to our agenda that we know we're not going to get the minority party's support on, that's what we need to whip.
And what about the across the aisle role for whips? Is there any, or is that done outside of the whip apparatus? If you're on the Republican side and you need some Democrats, or the other way around, how does that process take place? Or is it usually you're never going to convince anyone on the other side? Either they're in or they're out on a particular bill.
In these times, that's the case. You're never going to convince the other side. Previously, and I would say maybe going back pre-2009, there was a lot of convincing and bringing folks across the aisle. One, to your earlier point, you had earmarks back then. So there was bipartisan buy-in in legislation. That was both on the authorizing side as well as the appropriation side. But two, you could, again, back to a trade agreement, there were a group of House Democrats who were always considered free traders. And the whip would work with them separately off to the side to make sure that they had what they needed before that trade agreement was closed out. So you had a handful of, a dozen or so votes that you were working with on the Democratic side, which you knew you needed because you were going to lose some of those pro-labor Republicans back then. But it extended beyond just trade, where I mentioned the prescription drug benefit. There were members on the other side who we were working with during that period. Their leaderships knew about that, weren't happy about it. So often they were meeting with us in secret. And then some of it's out in the open where, Obama is bringing John Boehner down to the White House and working with him on a debt limit agreement. Or Joe Biden has tried kind of here in the beginning of having some Republican senators down to the White House to talk about infrastructure, COVID relief. So some of it's out in the open, but a lot of it is it's a nuance of the whip position to know which of these members of the other party are interested in this issue and are potentially gettable, and whether that's a worthwhile use of the whip's time to go down that rabbit hole, because oftentimes it bears no fruit.
So in terms of the whip apparatus compared to the other parts of leadership, can you talk more about how the different parts of leadership sort of work together and how they're distinct from each other in your experience?
Yeah, the simplest way to think about it is assuming you're in the majority party and talking about the House side. The speaker is both an institutional role, but it's also the de facto head of the party if you don't have the White House. They are the ultimate decision maker for the body, for the caucus or the conference, and all sort of flows from them. The leader is in charge of the agenda, of scheduling the agenda, coming up with the agenda, scheduling the agenda, and managing the committees to make sure those pieces of legislation are matching up with what the leadership has decided the agenda should be. The whip is responsible for making sure that agenda gets passed, that it has 218 votes, or in the case of the Senate, 51 or 60 votes. And then as you go down the leadership ladder, you have caucus chairs, conference chairs. They're the communicators of the conference or of the party. They're responsible for messaging that agenda. And then there's sort of some smaller roles throughout both chambers and both parties, but they're more entitled only, and they're folks wanting to move up in leadership eventually.
So let's talk about the speaker side of things, and specifically the calendar. You talked to the Modernization Select Committee Modernization about the calendar, and I was very interested in your comments there. There's discussion about how much time should be in DC versus their district. There's time in committee versus voting. Can you talk through the way you view the calendar, how it actually works out, and what are there any tools used to make that happen in the leadership office?
Sure. The calendar is the prerogative of the majority leader, and they guard it as such. So there's been lots of conversation over the years, and the Select Committee has also looked at changing the House calendar, but it's just never going to happen, in my opinion, because that truly is the core of what the majority leader position does, without giving up any sort of authority on that issue would neuter the leader in that position. I think about the calendar in a few different ways. One is the most basic. You want a highly functioning chamber. And so what's the best schedule for this chamber to be at its most efficient? And over the years, committees have grown and grown and grown. And members have multiple committee assignments in addition to multiple subcommittees on each of these individual committees they serve on. So their time is often overlapping you bifurcate the day between a committee time and time spent on the House floor to pass legislation, I think about it in terms of that bifurcation. How do you maximize time for members in committees? And then how do you make the time on the floor as useful as possible? So what we ended up doing at the beginning of 2011 is truly bifurcating the day, leaving the mornings untouched. The House used to come in the mornings for legislative business. They don't anymore, except for on days that they're leaving for the end of the week, whether that's a Thursday or Friday. So really creating protected time for committees so that they're not constantly interrupted with votes. And then creating an afternoon set aside where it's really the main purpose of the day is the House floor. Members have so many demands on their time, especially in the House. They're running for office every 2 years. The fundraising demands on them are pretty significant. They have all of these overlapping committee schedules. The House takes many more votes than the Senate does, so that the activity on the House floor is pretty constant. And then they're traveling to and from their districts, and a lot of these places are not easy to get to. So you're trying to all of those things are competing, and you're trying to maximize time, and it's done to varying degrees of success. But right now, I think the House has a fairly good, put aside COVID, because we're in just a completely unique time, and we have proxy voting, and it's basically a virtual Congress. But pre-COVID, and once we get past post-COVID, I think the House has a fairly efficient schedule. What needs to be cleaned up are the committee schedules.